Hello, and welcome back to the second part of this architecture and city lecture, second part of the City of Towers lecture. In the first part, I talked a lot about Le Corbusier and his visions of modernist planning, how he had those plans of implementing his ideas of that machine architecture, those visions of the contemporary city and the radiant city. Um, and then I went over to modernist planning in Brazil. And now, in the second part, I'm going to talk about how these ideas of Le Corbusier have been implemented in Britain and also in the US. And when we go through these examples, it shows pretty well, I think, common qualities, but also problem that we also know from our experience in Seoul. Okay, we start with Britain, and the ideas started to take root in Britain in the 60s and afterwards. And basically, because there's been a lot of sprawl. If you remember the lecture about the garden cities, then this was the beginning of sprawl in Britain, right? So instead of densifying the existing city, the outskirts, the suburbs were growing. And as you remember, probably the preferred way of housing in those suburbs was small row houses of one or two floors, maximum three, but overall quite low density. So you can imagine if you try to house all people in row houses with one or two floors, everybody has their front yard and backyard, that this is resulting in a large consumption of land, and the effect of this would be sprawl, right? People have to be spread out over a lot of land. So part of the ideas that were caught on the most were these ideas of kind of densified modern living. Um, yeah, here you can see a study of what it means if you house people in houses or if you house them at higher densities. Mm, it's not so much about the numbers, it's about the point that I just made, right? If you house people in low density, you consume more land. And there's this idea word coming up called subtopia, which is this manifestation of that emerging sprawl in Britain, where you at some point cannot distinguish anymore between the countryside, the suburbs, and the cities, or the grown cities and the new cities merge, and it becomes all one kind of undefinable mess, or it doesn't really have a characteristic or beauty of its own. It's just very straightforward, um, trying to solve the problem of housing without a deeper um, planning or idea of the aesthetic beauties, of idea of how you would want to live. So this started to become a problem, and in Britain, the idea of high-rise apartments has been embraced. So in the picture you see a couple of typical high-rise apartments at the time. So this took off in the 60s, right? Um, so economy was picking on after Second World War, and now there were more people in Britain, and there was a deficit of housing. Um, Still, the preferred way of living was the single-family home or the row house. So, in order to stimulate the or in order to make the flats more attractive, the government gave subsidies for the construction of high rises, and this resulted, obviously, in a lot of high rises being built. To be fair, there were also subsidies for low-rise apartments, but the high-rise apartment subsidies were much higher. So consequently, a lot of high-rise estates started emerging. That's what you see here in this graph. In the 1950s, only 7% were high-rise in Britain, and in 1960 that increased to 26%. And here you see an example of Alton West. So here you see a typology that reminds us of the ideas of Le Corbusier. So if you look at those towers, you see how they are put very rigidly on a grid. So there's very little concern for the topography, for the existing features of the landscape. The buildings are simply dropped as if from a giant hand down onto the landscape, and is in that sense kind of ignoring the landscape. And I picked this example because here you have in Alton East and Alton West, you have these two kind of paradigms of how high-rise estates can be organized. So on the one hand, you have this rigid layout, Le Corbusier, if you want, on the west side, simply following this kind of linear structure, and here these high-rise towers being set up on a grid. So again, based on the idea of the tabula rasa and ignoring the topographical features of the site. Then if you look on the east side here in Alton, then you see slightly more organic or playful arrangement of the towers that is reacting more to the existing landscape. To give you a little bit of an idea of the problem, so one of it was obviously the sprawl. So high-rise dense living was a way to deal with the sprawl, but on the other hand there were still run-down areas, overcrowded areas in England, still in the 1950s, 1960s. And building these high-rises was a way to do away with these slums, if you want. So the strategy was basically to demolish those slums and replace them with this kind of high-rise towers. So quickly, by the end of the 1960s, this led to emergence of a lot of these high-rise estates, and at some point there emerged a housing surplus. So at some point there was more housing available than people in need of housing. So people could start to be picky, right? The result of this was people still had a preference for row houses or single-family homes, like kind of the opposite of Korea. But whoever could would try to leave those high-rise estates, and that means only the economically more vulnerable, maybe less educated, maybe more the problem clients were left behind, and this was leading to more and more problems, and maybe even more importantly to a bad reputation of those high-rise estates in England. So whoever could would leave. Here's some images of the decay of those high-rise estates. So it's not only the houses, also public spaces are neglected, dirty, full of trash, things are destroyed, and so on. And I copied in a quote from one of the users of those estates, which I think illustrates quite well the initial success and the following decay of those high rises. So It hasn't anything to do with the block itself. Really, it was the change in the kind of people who lived there and how people behaved. When we first went in, we were introduced to the caretaker, a retired seaman. He was very enthusiastic about his job, and for the first 5 or 10 years, things were really great. Everybody kept the block spotless. You were really proud of having such a nice house. So, and now the other side. The problems arose after 5 to 10 years when they started putting in different kind of tenant. This was the idea of the corporate housing management. What a sick joke. They had the crazy idea that by spreading the bad ones among the normal tenants, you'd bring them up to your level. But what happened, especially in the big block like that, it was the opposite. They brought us down. It was like a kind of cancer. At first you tried to keep your standards up, but you soon learned it was a waste of time. And that's the end of the quote. So consequently, people would move out whoever could, right? They were in decay. And this happened all over England. This is a image of, sorry, what's the name of the building? The East London Ronan Point. And I picked this one because it symbolizes quite well how fed up people were with this kind of high-rise houses. So at some point what happened here was that there was a gas leak, and through the gas leak somehow ignited and an explosion took place, which took away the entire corner of the building. And this was a moment at which, yeah, what I found interesting is that the management and the authorities didn't regard this worthy of repairing. So once this big damage was done, probably if it would be a better type of housing, had a better reputation, tenants were, fond of their housing, then people would have thought, okay, it's worth to rebuild this and repair this. But instead it was torn down. And a couple of those failures of this high-rise, or what was perceived as a failure, you see in these 3 points. So there's too few lifts, long waiting times, there were too few, too small, too slow. And then there was a lot of children there, meaning it's very noisy. And then there was too little management, which also means too little maintenance. And I think that's one of the most important points. We'll see that also later in another example, where if there's too little management, the quality of everything deteriorates. Things are not kept clean or even functional, and then people just move out if they can afford. Okay, as a kind of reaction, what happened was that a new law was put in place, which the main intent of this law was to preserve parts of the grown old cities as a way of protecting the heritage. But at some point this became a way of keeping those high-rise developments out. Mainly because of the reputation. And yeah, so in that sense, this Housing Act of 1969 led to preservation frenzy. Parts of the cities were starting to be put under preservation that were not really of a deep cultural or historic value. Then in the early 70s, this building boom dropped. And I'm relating all of this to Le Corbusier, but just to be fair and to remind you, Le Corbusier never intended to put people in this kind of dimensions into high rises as it started happening in England and also in other countries. So for him, the high rise was a place for offices and commercial administrative functions, not for housing. And as you remember, in Le Corbusier's schemes, the housing was in the mid and the low-rise estates around those high-rise towers. Yeah, here there are some more images of that decay taking place. Really started becoming a problem. And then again on the other side, I see an example of what Le Corbusier actually did do with high-rise housing. And this is his famous building called Unité. And the Unité was built in Marseille, in France. But it was supposed to be like a typology that could be built in different places around the world. And a couple of them have been carried out. And the most famous of those is the Unité building in Marseille, because it's the most close to Le Corbusier's initial ideas. And it's also yeah, the most well preserved. So here the clientele was different. This was housing for the middle class, not the working and the lower class, but middle class. So people are more wealthy. That means there's more money for maintenance and also for services, and things are just kept in shape and better. Yeah, this is an example. You see how Le Corbusier combines the architecture on this big scale. You know, Le Corbusier was like architect, painter, and urban planner simultaneously, and it kind of comes together here. Right? You see how artistic he's playing with those colors, using the architecture to make that repetitive facade look interesting, and all of this has a like meaning for how people live in cities at the time, and now it makes sense within his vision of how the modern city should work. So this worked. So this is maybe a counterexample where you can say like yeah, high-rise living can actually work. It's a big discussion in Europe and also in the US. Like, is high-rise a bad typology by in itself? Which, if you look at it from Korean perspective, it's quite a ridiculous discussion, right? Because in Korea, probably the most wanted typology to live in is the high-rise. So essentially, the problem cannot be in the architectural typology. There must be something in how you deal with it, how you maintain it, how you finance it, or yeah, something about the process, not about the typology. So this idea went around the world and was also yeah, bastardized, if you want. So it's kind of interesting that it's been taken up in capitalist countries, but also in communist countries. Here's the idea of that giant block in the Soviet Union. So it's quite similar to the idea of Le Corbusier, that giant building with all different kind of functions in there. Also, you remember Le Corbusier had the idea of specializing, sourcing out all different activities. So the idea is that you would just live here, and then laundry would be done somewhere else. There would be collective cooking, right? There would be collective like childcare. So people can focus on their one job, their one occupation. And a similar idea was present in this Soviet architecture. So here even more prevalent, maybe because the dwellings were much smaller. It was really considered as a place to sleep, with a couple of serving functions. So if we take a better look at the Unité in Marseille, then you also see that it's kind of diverse housing, and it's quite generous. So this is a rough section diagram You see that there's a corridor in the center and then two apartments kind of shaping around like two hands. So you get quite an interesting spatial configuration and different from most apartments. Today you can also have double high space, so you don't feel like being put into this box, what you often have in these efficient apartment um, layouts. Yeah, so that's what you see here, double high space with a void. So there are really architectural spatial qualities to it, and balconies on the front. No, let's remove that. This is basically same thing, just in perspective, and such a famous and beautiful image, so I wanted to include it. And you also see his vision of how that architecture should work. So there's a clear distinction between the frame, the building, construction, all the infrastructure, whatever, gas, water, electricity, and then the housing that is kind of shoved in. So you can imagine within this framework a lot of different configurations are possible, bigger houses, smaller houses, and so on. So this speaks for diversity that is also lost in the construction process. When you just try to build a lot of dwelling units quickly, you tend to simply repeat. But in fact, the idea how Le Corbusier envisioned it was that you could have a much bigger range of diversity of housing. Another image showing the transition between inside and outside. You see that standardized furniture. Just to give you more of an impression how it works. Then the Unité building was not only housing, it was supposed to work as a small community. So you would also have the important necessities for daily life within the building. So there would be small shop, cafe, hairdresser, daycare, and so on. And here you see some images of daycare on the rooftop, swimming pool on the rooftop, and you would have on certain floors a concentration of these public functions that you would call something like streets in the air, where people would gather. All right, and then from here we go to the US, and in the US you have different kind of situation. So here the problem was that cities were being torn apart, and sometimes the densities were really low, and parts of the old city were decaying. So here the application of the modernist high-rise flat was more to redevelop existing parts of the of the city, and for this also government regulation was put in place. So the 1949 Act is when it started. You don't have to remember the name of the act, it's just to give you an idea, like 1949, World War II ended 45, so shortly after they started with this kind of program, and what they did was that they financed public institutions to stimulate redevelopment projects. So there were different ways to do this, create an organization simply similar to the LCC in London. Here it's Federal Housing Administration, and give these rights. So they could help individual families with mortgage financing. Yeah, they would receive money to build about 800,000 public housing units, and there was research involved. So there was a whole program. Again, you don't have to remember exactly all the measures they took, but they were taking this serious. They invested a lot of money, created the government institution, and really wanted to push this urban redevelopment with these densified high-rise houses. And then from here we go to the next one. So here you see the before and after image of this redevelopment. It's a American city, but picture the process looks very similar to what they've been doing in Korea. Right, simply take an old low-rise, high-density, decayed neighborhood, tear it all down and replace it. In the end there will be modern high-rise towers standing there on a big open space, park-like setting. And that would of course reshape the cities. Yeah, more images of that. There's the blighted, the rundown kind of slums, and those were red lines. So that means city government would decide this area is a bad area, put a like red line on the map, and then this would be declared housing redevelopment area. And yeah, it's part of a whole system. So once that area has been declared, housing redevelopment was not allowed anymore to build new things unless, you know, the whole thing was torn down. And then people had a hard time getting credit to improve something. So yeah, people were incentivized, if you want, through this regulation to sell their houses, move somewhere else, and then it could get redeveloped. The people that are in favor of this policy say, right, this is good, you need some kind of push, some kind of force from the government to get some speed into this redevelopment projects, otherwise people never move out and things just decay and it stays a mess forever. And other people say that in this process the government was in fact forcing some kind of gentrification, kind of coercing people or pushing people out through this policy that would otherwise have stayed. I leave it like this for now. There's a whole like big discussion about that. And then in the next image there's another policy that also had an effect on the cities in the US, which was the Federal Aid Highway Act. So politically it was wanted to connect the different cities better, right? After the Second World War, economy was booming in the US. Everybody started to buy cars, so now cities had to be fit for the car, and that meant you would need new highways. And outside of the city it's easy to make new highways, but inside you have to cut through existing urban fabric. So and there was similar kind of problem that, you know, the old rundown areas were, from a public point of view, maybe the ones that are the most dispensable, so that's where the highways would go through. But then on the other hand, this came with a kind of forced eviction of people that would otherwise have wanted to stay, and a lot of these neighborhoods were inhabited by predominantly blacks or Latinos, which also meant there's a yeah, kind of racial perspective to it. Yeah, we'll also talk about this more in another lecture. So that's what you see here. And then if you think about that redevelopment, then you have to think that there's predominantly low-income people living in those old rundown houses, and it gets replaced with new towers, modernist towers. And situation is actually quite similar to what you have in Korea. These new apartments, they have a kind of extra costs, right? They have maintenance fees, monthly maintenance fees. So for some people of the lower income or unemployed that live in those rundown areas, simply the maintenance cost in that new apartment are too much to afford. So even if you would give landowners a new apartment in the in the new development, it would be unaffordable for them to live there because they cannot afford those running costs. So this becomes a way of promoting segregation, and that's another kind of criticism on this policy. Then on the one hand, you produce new houses and they are definitely in a better technical shape, but at the same time you also enforce a process of gentrification. This is another act. It also happened not only for housing but also for commercial development, but it's kind of the same scheme. So here you see how a housing area was redlined and then redeveloped into commercial, different areas in the US where this took place. And then, for some people it was seen as a win because the city also looked better, more modern and so on, but for others this was a loss in terms of the old urban fabric, but also for those people that used to live there. So what people talk about, some scholars say when you think about those redevelopment plans, is that there was some kind of redevelopment coalition or growth coalition where you would have the city government making new rules and regulations or redlining certain areas, and bankers and developers working together with retailers and realtors to kind of push projects through. And then of course on the other hand there's this disregard for social aspects of that redevelopment. This is a figure that became famous, Robert Moses in New York. He was pushing lots of evictions because he was in charge of planning highways in New York. Spent a lot of money on highways and with it urban renewal in New York. Then out of this kind of resistance emerged. And I'm going through these slides a little bit quicker because we'll talk about this conflict more. There's then on the one hand Robert Moses as part of this government-led redevelopment coalition, kind of the typical planner, maybe a little bit like Le Corbusier, a highly trained expert that was making decisions like in his office, deciding where things have to be destroyed for the good of the city. And then on the other hand, you probably heard of Jane Jacobs, who's this grassroots activist who was fighting for the preservation of those areas that Robert Moses, or some of those areas that Robert Moses tried to demolish. And then there's this whole conflict coming up about history and preservation and modernization and efficiency. Like where do you stand? And that, once again, that will be an interesting discussion for us to decide. Like, what is more important? Is it the efficiency of the city, that everything works well, is modern, or the heritage and the social fabric? I'll go through this more quickly. So as I pointed out before, there's relation between the public like City Hall and big developers, construction companies that try to push these kind of developments. This is an example before and after from Boston. So here you see architecturally, I guess you can say it's improving. There's some space coming in the public space, more designed architecture, starting to become more interesting than this kind of densified area. But then also here there were huge discussions about the social repercussions of that development. similar process happening in Boston. I included this because he's a famous figure. If you're interested in this more, you can read the book of Herbert Guns, who was like studying those old villages. So he's kind of similar to Jane Jacobs, but studying other parts and other cities. And this is an example of one of those redevelopment projects where you see old, blighted, kind of low-rise, low-density area here, and then it gets replaced with something like this, kind of shiny, new, modern, and much more dense. And yeah, of course, looking much more fresh. Yeah, but then the question is if it's like really thought through on all levels. By the way, same discussion is happening in Seoul, right? Since Mayor Park is in charge, this kind of redevelopment is not pushed forward anymore. So he's advocating a more sensitive, kind of soft way of redevelopment. So maybe it will be interesting for us to have this discussion about what's happening in Seoul right now. And this is kind of a summary as a showing the results of urban renewal. So this is a calculation by Anderson, and it says that by 1965, renewal would have evicted 1 million people from their houses. Most of them paid low rents. And then 90% of them relocated to other substandard housing, other kind of slums or deteriorated houses somewhere else, and they paid higher rents. So for them, living this circumstances did not improve, but they paid higher rents. And renewal program destroyed 4 times as many housing units as have been built. So this has also something to do with in those low-rise areas, people tend to live on very small spaces, and there's a long construction period, average 12 years, which also means it takes a long time before people can settle back in again, which also means that a lot of those people that originally lived there by the time already moved somewhere else and are fine somewhere else, so they don't even want to come back. So another factor of like state-led gentrification or eviction. And 40% of the new construction was not for housing. So in order to make those projects feasible, there was a lot of commercial program included in the project. So what he's saying is kind of cynic. At the cost of more than $3 million, the Urban Renewal Agency has succeeded in materially reducing the supply of low-cost housing in American cities. So if the objective was to increase low income housing, then it was not a success. So what you can see here is that maybe the main reason of this was to get rid of those old deteriorated housing areas and simply replace them with new and modern ones. Yeah, this is another book, similar perspective. I'm not going to go into it. Through the next slides rather quick, because this is again about the kind of conflict between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. Again, same thing. And then I have a documentary that I want you guys to watch, which is very well done, describing the rise and the decay of a housing estate in the US. So this housing estate is called Pruitt-Igoe, and it's described very well how in the beginning you see how this has been constructed with the best intentions and yeah, really noble goals, providing high density affordable housing for people within New Orleans. And then it explains very well how the decay started happening, how this process is a result of underfunding and yeah, bad maintenance, and so on. You will see all of that in the Pruitt-Igoe documentary. So here are some images of how it worked in the beginning, proud owners of their new apartment. Everything is clean and works, and all of a sudden people have facilities that were much better than what they had before, sense of community, belonging together. And then people started to be unable to afford living there anymore, couldn't pay rents anymore, meaning once they couldn't pay rents, then maintenance would be neglected because the state didn't want to pay for the maintenance of these housing estates. It had to come all from the rent, so if the rentees don't pay anymore, there's a problem. And then things don't get maintained anymore, which then means the living conditions deteriorate, and the ones that can afford move out, similar to what I've shown you in England. And then as a consequence, the ones that stay behind are the poorer ones, and then there's even less money for maintenance and more social problems, and slowly it starts becoming a slum. I will upload that also to the Cyber Campus, and I will give you a couple of questions to answer when you watch that. So kind of sad end of that high-rise housing estate was the demolition in the early 70s, and since then in the US and in most Western countries, well, not only since Pruitt-Igoe, but since kind of failed projects like Pruitt-Igoe, there's always been a bad reputation around these kind of projects, and this whole typology of high-rise living, yeah, has a kind of bad smell around it. It's kind of funny for me when I came to Korea to see how this is different here and how it actually works. Okay, we'll talk more about that in another lecture, and this is the end. Thanks you for listening, and don't forget to watch the documentary. I will upload the questions as well as soon as I have them. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.